Hello everyone, I'm Elfowls, and welcome to another match analysis for the Newport Noctiles in Season 12 of the Wooper Club League. Last time I covered my Week 8 match against the Kanto Kinglers, an unexpectedly close one where his Salamence almost got the better of me, but I was able to grab the 3-0 win to get up to an 8-0 record for the season. This time, the last week of the regular season puts me up against Steve and his 5-2 Waterdeep Wobbuffets. I've played Steve a lot in this league. I believe we met in Season 7 where we exchanged successful gym offense matches, with him beating my ghosts and me beating his dragons. We've had plenty of matches since then. In Season 8 I played him once in the middle of the season and once in the playoffs, and took both wins there, and then in Season 9, Illogic and I beat Steve and Fruit Taco in the playoffs, overcoming their super boosted Tapu Fini that basically played out like a doubles Dondozo long before Dondozo even existed. Our Season 10 match was another win for me off the back of Extreme Speed Raichu, but then in Season 11 I took a loss to Steve in Week 1, featuring a Melodic that walled most of my team and a Swords Dance Haxorus to clean up. That was a tough loss, and he's always played me pretty well, so this is sure to be a good match. On the other hand though, we are both locked for playoffs, and in my opinion very likely to meet again very soon, so I'm inclined to hold back on certain strategies this week, and I'm sure Steve has the same interest in mind. I'm still trying to grab a win since it's the last obstacle between me and an undefeated regular season, but I'm going to try and stick to the basics and save some of my strategies for a potential rematch down the line. With that being said, the team we're dealing with consists of Weavile at the top of the speed tiers, Roaring Moon that can not Terra, Gengar, Sandy Shocks, Quaquaval, Dragonite that can also not Terra, the Klefki that I dropped earlier this season, Scovillain, Orthworm, Scizor, and Torkoal. This is a pretty well built team, and a pretty aggressively built team. Every team member besides some of the steel types and that Torkoal qualifies as a giant offensive threat to me, and even those support pieces are contributing to an offensive game plan with sun support from the Torkoal and screens from the Klefki. It's a stacked team offensively. His combination of physical attackers is half the reason I decided to pick up Dondozo in the middle of my draft, and somehow his special offense is just as threatening. It's tough to call anything out as bad against my team. I will start though by calling out the Sun Core as probably not the best to bring into me. There are a couple things to address here, but the main thing is that a Scovillain sweep doesn't look very easy on paper. Tyranitar obviously stops the weather if I were to bring that, but outside of that, Hydreigon and Farigiraf can take multiple hits, and Iron Moth requires specialized coverage to even touch. And then Torkoal could just come on the merits of general sun support, but I don't know about that either. As a Sunsetter, Torkoal actually threatens Tyranitar quite a bit with Body Press, and Steve has some pretty good Protosynthesis abusers, but I also have some Sun abusers of my own. Great Tusk and Iron Moth would love the boost in power to their moves. I will have to pack a few backup answers to Sun just in case it were to come, but I'm not focused too hard on it with my build. The only other Pokemon I'll count out is Orthworm. Its notable qualities include multiple hazards to set up and a strong body press, and that's about it. Unless it wants to Terra, it loses to just about everything relevant on my team, most importantly my Rapid Spinners, so no Worm today. Next up is going to be Weavile, and I love this Pokemon, but it doesn't look that good here. It's got tough matchups against Azumarill, Dondozo, Fortress, and Iron Moth, most of those which are just so easy to switch into it, that they just make it tough to use. It has a few good matchups. It's a good pressure piece for some of my offensive mons, but Steve also hasn't favored it much this season, so pass. And then we have Klefki, which is always something to keep in mind in a team builder, as I learned the hard way against Screamtail, screens are super tough to deal with when you're unprepared for them. And of course spike stacking is also viable, and so is Thunderwave to slow down a sweeper. But realistically, I have good counterplay to all of that. A lot of the sweepers it wants to cripple can just one-hit KO in return, and my hazard removal game is pretty great, and then finally I'm pretty well prepared to deal with screens this time. Moving along, Quaquaval kicks off the top 6, and the main thing to account for here is that boosting set, which can either set up Swords Dance or Bulk Up and then start sweeping with that speed boosting Aqua Step to get so many stat boosts. Yes, Dondozo makes this tough to pull off, but Quaquaval can use Taunt or Encore to mess with that, as well as Roost to stay healthy and Terastallization to get a type advantage. So there are a few ways it can play around that matchup. That said, it is a pretty tough matchup for it. It's also just a good utility piece with a potential Aqua Jet to keep a few of my sweepers in check, and Rapid Spin as reliable hazard removal. So theoretically I have a pretty good matchup into it, but it's still got a lot of utility despite that. A lot of room to outplay me if it wants to. That's next to another strong utility Pokemon with Scizor, which is an even better hazard remover with Defog, and yet another great priority option with Bullet Punch. The combo of Bullet Punch and U-Turn has the potential to put me in some awkward situations, since I don't actually have much that's comfortable taking repeated hits from either move. Dondozo comes in clutch yet again to help out with that, but of course I can't rely on Dondozo for everything. Especially given the power of Sandy Shocks, which takes that Dondozo matchup and turns it into free damage and momentum with Volt Switch. Not much on my team likes to switch into that. My electric immunities are both frail on the special side, and while Hydreigon and Rotom are nice walls to this guy, they both just get Volt Switched on the switch anyway. I expect this to be making the most progress out of any of Steve's pieces, especially surrounded by the physical threats that can force in my defensive pieces for it to come in on. That's exemplified pretty well by Roaring Moon, which has a pretty good and threatening Dragon Dance set, but I think it has a better choice item set here, mostly because of Dondozo, U-turning out of that physically defensive check and getting into that Sandy Shocks for more breaking potential. I think it can definitely afford to run a basic set like that, since Steve also has a Dragonite for more diverse Dragon-type uses. I'm not sure exactly what kind of set it would want to run, but it can get around its typical checks one way or another. Dondozo should beat Banded or Dragon Dance sets, but it's scared of special attacking sets and can't do much to a defensive Dragonite. And Azumarill is also a good check, but it's afraid of electric coverage and doesn't like its bulky weakness policy potential if Dragonite has that multiscale intact. And speaking of which, multiscale is probably the biggest issue to deal with, since it means Dragonite can win most matchups one-on-one from full health. It's going to be a pain. I'll have to figure out what set it's running before I really know how to deal with it. And lastly, we have Gengar, which is very similar to Sandy Shocks in that it can pivot in on the physical walls that are forced in by the rest of the team, but instead of threatening momentum with Volt Switch, it just threatens by KOing things. Gengar, at least theoretically, has coverage to 2-hit KO everything on my team with a Specs or Life Orb set, with plenty of super effective coverage to go around. Now, to be fair, it doesn't have the move slots to do all of that with one set, so it's not like it's beating my whole team, but that's still very threatening unless I figure out a good answer. So I kind of highlighted the game plan I expect, heavy physical offense with Sandy Shocks and Gengar to punish my responses to it. With that being said, I will start my build with the natural physical wall. Dondozo is just too good into this team to leave behind. I've got a pretty simple rest talk set here, max physical defense to take as many hits as possible from the Roaring Moon, Scizor, and Quaquaval, among others. Liquidation is the nice stab move for good neutral damage, with Order Up as the coverage of choice to hit Dragonite and Roaring Moon hard. We also have the Rocky Helmet, the best way to punish Roaring Moon's U-turn in my opinion, Unaware to stop obvious setup, and Terra Fairy allows Dondozo to answer more variants of Dragonite, losing the electric weakness and becoming immune to Draco Meteors that would otherwise really hurt. It's a pretty simple set, but it counters a good chunk of Steve's roster by itself. Let's move on. Iron Moth is actually going to be my win condition for this game. The idea is to come in on a weakened team and just clean up with 4-move coverage. We have Booster Energy to boost speed, which means I'm running max speed to tie with Scarf Gengar, and 1 point less in special attack than that to get the speed boost. As for the moves, Fiery Dance is stab and has that nice chance to boost special attack. Dazzling Gleam hits the dragons, thank goodness neither of them can Terra. Psychic is a harder hit on the Gengar and Quaquaval. And then in the last slot I have Terra Water Terra Blast. This isn't doing that much for me offensively, but it's mostly just there to 1-hit KO Sandy Shocks. And defensively, Terra Water is really nice. The main point of it is to resist Quaquaval's Aqua Jet while also keeping the resistance to Scizor's Bullet Punch and Weavile's Ice Shard, whereas other Terra types would be a little too vulnerable to priority to get a full sweep. We definitely want chip on a few things before the sweep can happen. Torkoal can take a hit in the sun pretty comfortably, Roaring Moon needs a tiny bit of chip to guarantee the KO with Dazzling Gleam, and Dragonite especially needs to be heavily chipped, but a late game sweep is very possible. And even outside of sweeping purposes, this is a nice check to Scovillain if that does come, since +1 Iron Moth does actually outspeed Chlorophyll Scovillain. Okay, so far we have a sweeper that mostly needs chip on Dragonite, and a wall that's threatened out by Sandy Shocks. So my next bring to help both of those out is Azumarill with a Wockenberry. Azumarill naturally matches up pretty well into most Dragonite sets, doing very heavy damage with a max attack Play Rough. Even if Azumarill ends up losing the matchup one-on-one, that should be plenty of damage for Iron Moth to pick up the KO later in the match. The other main use for Azumarill is to be able to safely attack the Sandy Shocks. With the Wockenberry, we have one less Pokemon that's immediately threatened out by a Volt Switch, meaning Sandy Shocks is that much worse at generating momentum. If I get that matchup, I'm probably going for Aqua Jet to bring Sandy Shocks below half before it can Volt Switch out. Then, for the rest of the match, if we get that matchup again, Azu can just Aqua Jet to finish it off, so we don't have to worry about that Volt Switch. And outside of those specific counter matchups, as Azu just has good matchups overall into things like Weavile and Quaquaval, taking some pressure off of Dondozo to handle those. As for the moveset, I really only felt the need for dual stabs plus Aqua Jet as priority, so I threw Substitute in the last slot just in case I want to predict a switch out or something like that, since Azumarill does tend to force those. We're Terra Water, as usual, Azu just appreciates the extra power on Aqua Jet in a pinch. Up next we have our Volt Switch blocker and Klefki answer with Assault Vest Great Tusk. This is an offensive spread, but hopefully it switches in safely on Sandy Shocks to stop that Volt Switch momentum, with the Assault Vest guaranteeing that we avoid the 2-hit KO from Timid Earth Power. The AV also means that Great Tusk can switch on Klefki and take a Dazzling Gleam or two, using Brick Break to get rid of those screens that it would want to set up. The other moves are pretty self-explanatory. Headlong Rush is our strongest stab that gets good coverage, Ice Spinner is for the dragons, and Rapid Spin makes this our hazard remover that Gengar would be hard-pressed to switch in on. Once again, this is a pretty good offensive piece with a bit more defensive utility this time thanks to that ground typing and Assault Vest, or even Terra Grass in case I want to resist that Sandy Shock's Earth Power in a pinch. And to complement the elephant, we have the Giraffe. Farigiraf is back with a full special defensive set this time, and this is mostly a switch into Gengar. With full Spadef and leftovers, we do avoid the 2-hit KO from any Specs move aside from the unlikely Dark Pulse. From there, we can set up a Wish in its face and pass that to any teammate, maybe even with the slow Baton Pass. I think any of the team members I've already gone over would love a Wish Pass, since they would all they're all prone to getting worn down over the course of the match, so I see this as a really good support for the whole team. Future Sight is also here for supportive purposes, mostly because setting that up and then getting into Great Tusk with Baton Pass would be some insane offensive pressure. Seriously, besides maybe Dragonite, what switches into Great Tusk when there's a Future Sight up? This looks like a really good matchup for Farigiraf to support the team. We even tank Sandy Shocks all day, and then Terra Fairy to also set up team support in front of the likes of Roaring Moon. Lastly, I went with Armor Tail as the ability. This was mostly a choice to counter a Banded Dragonite locked into Extreme Speed, but I mean, I didn't really see any of the abilities coming into play that much. Cool set, cool Pokemon, love Farigiraf. Let's get into the last pick, which is Hydreigon. We're running a Choice Scarf this week, with enough speed to outpace +1 Quaquaval and take it out with the Draco. Fast Draco Meteors really are the game plan here. Between just that and Flamethrower, Hydreigon has unresisted coverage into my opponent's roster, making for a pretty good revenge killer in just 2 move slots. So everything else is utility. U-Turn makes this a nice fast pivot, and Stealth Rock makes this my only hazard setter in the matchup. Hydreigon is actually my planned lead, since I'm really expecting Sandy Shocks as Steve's lead, and we kind of wall its dual stabs and get up rocks for free, and I can also find out pretty early if it's Choice Scarfs itself if it Volt Switches first. That's pretty much it. It's a simple set. Terra Steel is a classic at this point, and it gives Hydreigon a resistance to Gengar's Dazzling Gleam, as well as certain priority moves like Dragonite's E-Speed and Weavile's Ice Shard. So, that's the team. Pretty straightforward outside of the Walkenberry tech on Azumarill, but yeah, nothing too fancy this time. I'll see you in the battle. So the Sun Core did show up, replacing the Scizor and Quaquaval that I was expecting. I'm not very happy to see that. I didn't prep all that much for Scovillain, and Sun also gets in the way of Terra Blast from Iron Moth, but I do have some built-in checks to Scovillain, so let's hope that isn't enough to take care of business on that front. Also, the lack of Scizor means that Draco Meteor from Hydreigon is completely unresisted now, and on top of the resistance to both Sandy Shocks and Scovillain's stab moves, Hydreigon looks amazing in this matchup. It's still my plan lead to set rocks though, so let's start with that. Good luck, have fun to Steve. The Dragonite lead, that is very interesting. Draco Meteor is super tempting here, but obviously that doesn't kill through multiscale, and Elite Dragonite usually implies some sort of weakness policy set that's trying to avoid Stealth Rock damage. So I'm just going to go ahead and break multiscale with a U-turn. Into what though? My first instinct was Dondozo to deal with a potential weakness policy Dragon Dance set, but if Dragonite's going for any attack right now, it's probably a Dragon move. Maybe a Draco? If that's the case, I'd rather not bring in Dondozo. How about Azumarill instead for the immunity? But that is actually going to be an agility. Weird. That does probably imply some kind of special or mixed set, so I'm glad I went Azu. With multiscale broken, Playrough should pick up the KO here, and I should be safe from a KO myself. Thunder, which hits, triggers the Wakanberry, and I see the Life Orb recoil, and then my Playrough does hit and KO. That was a weird turn. Based on the calc, that looked like max special attack on Dragonite. I'm glad I didn't bring in Dondozo. So between Agility, Life Orb, Thunder, Lead Dragonite, and Wakanberry Azumarill, we basically got 2 neat tricks that kind of cancel each other out for the most part. I cannot use Azumarill to beat Sandy Shocks anymore thanks to the lack of a Whack and Berry. Speaking of which, that is the revenge. But to trade that for a dead Dragonite, I will take that. We're already getting close to an Iron Moth sweep, actually. I do have to deal with this Sandy Shocks though, but Hydreigon is going to be a pretty easy choice to resist any incoming stab move, which is just going to be a Volt Switch. That's expected, crit's a little unfortunate, and that does bring in the Roaring Moon. I'm definitely afraid of a Scarf set on this to outspeed my own Scarf, so Dondozo is going to be my easy response. Yeah, U-turn is expected. I actually do more damage back with Helmet, and of course Sandy Shocks is back in. I will actually take that. The chip on Roaring Moon from the Rocky Helmet was actually pretty important to get that into Iron Moth range, but once again I'm paying for that progress with the Sandy Shocks matchup. I could go Hydreigon again, but I don't love being in this cycle for very long. Steve could Volt Switch and U-turn with these two all day, so I'm just going to try to end that here and now with Great Tusk. He probably shouldn't be going for Earth Power here. And yes, I do just block a Volt Switch. I haven't seen an item yet. I wonder if he's locked in with something like a Scarf. That actually shouldn't matter much though. Headlong Rush looks like the best move to go here, go for here no matter what. It's either a free KO on the Sandy Shocks or guaranteed damage into any switch in. But Terra Ice, Terra Blast, and of course my Headlong Rush is no longer super effective, so it doesn't KO. But thanks to my Assault Vest, I did live the turn. That is a really cool Terra though, no pun intended. Sandy Shocks now has super effective coverage against almost my whole team, except for one. Farigiraf should be able to switch in and take the next hit, but I had to ask myself, is that worth it? I am trying to save Farigiraf to take on the Gengar in the back, so I'm trying to avoid extra damage on it. But I do think it's fine to bring it in now. It's only going to take around 30% maybe from any move this thing's going for. And I'm also seeing some nice value from Great Tusk still, even at low health. If it gets in for free against the Torkoal, for example, that's a free Sun-boosted Headlong Rush, so I'd really like to preserve that last 18% of its health for later. So that does mean I'm going to allow Farigiraf to switch in and take the Earth Power. Only 29%, that's not too bad. Next order of business, I'd like to get a Wish up, so as the Shocks is going to Volt Switch out to Roaring Moon, I can Wish, and because I'm strongly suspecting a choice set, I'll protect both to get my health back and see what this wants to lock into, but it is just a hard switch out. Probably trying to avoid helmet damage from the Dondozo, and I'm actually back in the same Farigiraf versus Sandy Shocks matchup, but I'm at full health this time. I think I can afford to take an attack and come back in later, so I am going to Baton Pass to get the slow pivot, as the Sandy Shocks first Volt Switches out to the Gengar. Ooh, that's a little awkward. I kind of already have my Gengar check in right now as I'm pivoting out. I guess I'll bring in Hydreigon here, but I was pretty hesitant to do so. For one thing, I don't know a single thing about this Gengar. It could have a Scarf of its own with Dazzling Gleam or Focus Blast to just KO me. And for another thing, I am kind of showing my hand with the Scarf by bringing in Hydreigon Raw. Knowing the Gengar probably has that coverage, I am kind of just showing off that, yeah, I have a Scarf and I'm expecting to outspeed you. But I didn't really have anything else to bring in here. The decision now basically boils down to if I think the Gengar is Scarfed itself or not. If it is Scarfed, I should probably switch right back to Farigiraf to avoid getting Hydreigon KO'd here. If I think it's not Scarfed, Draco is super free and should just be claiming a KO this turn. I decided that I'm going to stay in and go for it. It's a tough decision, but I think Roaring Moon should just be this team's one Scarfer, and this opportunity is really just too good to pass up, so I am going to take the risk. Just please don't be Scarf Gengar. Okay, Draco grabs the one-hit KO for a 6-4 game. This is looking pretty good, other than the fact that Cursed Body did activate, and I also definitely revealed that I'm Choice Scarf, so Steve gets to do whatever he wants here. He just gets to bring in the Torkoal for free to set up that Sun, and I am forced to switch out unless I want to go for a struggle on this turn. Azumarill feels like a fine way to sponge a hit, but of course Steve knew that I had to switch out, so he gets to drop in Scovillain completely risk-free, and this is kind of a tough spot all of a sudden. I have a couple switch-ins here, but they're all risky. Hydreigon could go down to a couple of Specs moves. Farigiraf is in the same boat with a bit of chip damage. Man, I wish I had brought Sap Sipper on that guy. And Iron Moth resists both stabs, but cannot one-hit KO in return. And there's also the risk of Scovillain going for Growth on the switch. For that reason, and because I'm ahead by a few KOs, I think I'm going to be okay with sacking Azumarill to prevent a Growth sweep. So that means I leave it in, and it does just go down to the Solar Beam. I went for Play Rough there as the strongest move I have to punish Growth under the sun, but in hindsight I think I could have gone for an Aqua Jet for some chip. Even if it had gone for Growth, to not KO me that turn, a pair of Aqua Jets would have likely pushed Scovillain into Iron Moth range for a revenge, and probably a subsequent sweep for that matter. As it stands though, I know Hydreigon can take at least one hit, so that's going to be my revenge. Draco should just be claiming another KO here, and that's going to be on these Sandy Shocks, which Steve just decides to sack for a 5-3 game. Only the Sun Core and Roaring Moon left to deal with, so we're kind of getting into the endgame here. It's actually the Scovillain that's going to come back in. I was expecting the Roaring Moon, but it's not Scarf or it's scared of Dondozo. Either way, fine by me. I skipped ahead in the turn a little bit, but ignore that for now. The fact is that I know Scovillain can't KO me from here, so I'll take my Draco chip. The play I'm making on this turn is just to sack Hydreigon for the chip damage, and then kind of let Iron Moth in after that, which should be able to handle everything else from there. I just need to make sure before I make the play that I have enough in the back to prevent a Scovillain sweep in case that Iron Moth plan doesn't work out. And I think even without Hydreigon around, Farigiraf should be able to prevent a full sweep if it comes down to that. So yes, I am comfortable sacking up Hydreigon. So I am just going to leave it in. It gets hit by the Flamethrower, and my Draco in return does plenty of damage back. Only thing I'll note there is that it looks like for the Scovillain, that's a max roll for Modest with no boosting item, but honestly at this point that doesn't matter too much. I have the chip that I need. Hydreigon, I'm completely letting it go down to the next Flamethrower just for that free switch into Iron Moth. We can come in and grab the speed boost from our booster energy, and it looks like we can go on kind of on a tear here. Fire Dance is very free to go for. We outspeed every time. We grab that KO. Unfortunately, not the special attack boost. And Roaring Moon is in next with the Photosynthesis in the Sun with the attack boost. And if this is Jolly Scarf, it actually does outspeed me. So I'm going to Terrastalize so that the incoming Earthquake that I'm expecting barely doesn't KO me. But I actually just outspeed anyway, and we take out Dazzling Gleam. And Torkoal is last. That's just going to be a couple of Terra Blasts. The first one does about half, but we do live the turn, and Sun goes down to guarantee that the next one KOs. So we're going to take the game 4-0. Good game to Steve. It was a decently clean match. It was cool to see every one of my Pokemon come in and do basically what I expected them to do. I think it came together pretty well. It was great seeing Hydreigon go off as much as it did against a team with no Dragon Resists, and it was also pretty neat to see Roaring Moon kind of stuffed out by Dondozo. Despite that though, I'll go with Iron Moth as the MVP. Definitely the centerpiece of my game plan that was able to get off that mini sweep to end the game. I'll go ahead and wrap up though in the interest of being concise, since this was a pretty quick battle, not too much to go over, and no spoilers here, but I do see a rematch video against Steve in my future, so expect some more Wobbuffets Noctowls content coming. With that said, that is a wrap for the regular season. I had already grabbed the first seed, but this one cements the undefeated record leading up to the playoffs, 8-0 with a plus 34 differential, I believe. This has been, by the numbers, my best regular season in the league. That takes us into the playoffs, where being the first seed means I get to play the fourth seed, and I thought that would be Steve after our match, but with Greg's loss this week, he and the Quiet Majesty dropped to that fourth seed right behind the Wobbuffets, so that's who I'm going to be up against in round 1. Last time we played in week 2, it was a 5-0 win for me off the back of a great Tusk sweep. Let's see if we can make that happen again. I'll see you next time in the Season 12 playoffs.